Hi, this is Oksana, and welcome to my 5th lesson about photography. In this lesson, we'll talk about depth of field. But before we get started, I would like to mention one thing. Imagine you look at the picture. What will you look first at? Usually, the person's eyes and the brain made that way that we have a tendency to look at the sharpest point at the image. So while we are taking a picture, we have to keep that in mind. And we have to focus on the point we want to draw attention to. So let's say we're taking somebody's portrait. In the portrait, of course, the person is the main subject, and we would like to highlight the person, especially the eyes. So we will be focusing on the eyes. But let's say we have a distracting background like this. The background distracts the viewer from the person. So what we can do? We can blur out the background so more attention goes on the person. Do you see the difference? Also, let's say we have a couple of subjects in the image, but we would like to highlight one of them. The good way to do this is to bring the sharpness to the subject, focus on the subject, and blur out everything around, like this. On the other hand, when we take a picture of the landscape, in landscape photography, everything in the image is important. And we kind of want your eye to travel around the picture. That's why in this case, we will try to bring everything in focus. This has to do something with depth of field. So let's start our lesson. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest object in the scene what appears sharp or in focus in an image. In this diagram, white oval would be representing our subject. As we focus on it with our camera, everything between red lines will appear in focus. Everything what is before red line closer to the camera will be out of focus, and also everything which is behind those two red lines will be out of focus as well. So actually the distance between those two red lines will be depth of field. Let's add two more subjects and put them next to the subject on which we are focusing our camera. So this way all three subjects are pretty much the same distance from the camera. Let's see how it will work in practice. As you can see, all three subjects are in focus. And now let's try to move our subject. Let's put one of them before the red line and another one behind the red line further from the camera. Remember, we are focusing on the middle one. And as you can see in this picture, two subjects we moved further from the camera and closer to the camera appear out of focus. But what if we want to keep them in this position but still get all three subjects into focus? Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. All we have to do is to change our depth of field. We have to make our depth of field greater, as it is shown in this diagram. See, all three objects are in focus now. I know, you all have a question right now, but how do we make our depth of field smaller or bigger? There is three criteria which influence the depth of field, and one of them is our aperture opening. The bigger our aperture opening, which is actually a smaller f number, the less depth of field we get. And the smaller the aperture opening, the bigger the f number, the more depth of field we get. For this picture, I used f1.4, which is the biggest aperture in the lens I used. As you can see, just a little part of the image is in focus. You can see that only number 25 is in focus. In this image, I used f4. And you can see that more of the image appears in focus. Pretty much the numbers from 24 to 27 are in focus now. And finally, I used the smallest aperture possible for my lens, which is f16. And as you can see, pretty much everything is in focus in this image. The other thing which influences depth of field is the focal length of the lens. Depth of field decreases with increasing the focal length of the lens if subject distance stays the same. So the longer the lens, the less depth of field, and the shorter the lens, the more depth of field. This way, I would have much broader depth of field with 18mm lens than I would have with 200mm lens. Let's see how it works in practice. While I was taking these images, I was the same distance from my subject, so I wouldn't change my position. To get closer to the subject, I would only change the focal length of my lens. My aperture will also stay the same, at f5.6. I will be focusing on the figurine of the woman. So, while I'm changing my focal length, please pay attention how the background will change. For these shots, I used my 18 to 200mm zoom lens. So I started with 18mm. And as you can see, pretty much everything in the image appears in focus. Then I zoomed in my lens to 30, then to 50, to 120, and finally to 200mm, which is the longest focal length possible for my lens. As you noticed, I hope you noticed, that my lady's figurine was in focus, but the background behind her was becoming more and more out of focus. Which means the longer is the focal length of the lens, the less depth of field you get. But keep in mind, I didn't change my distance to the subject. And talking about distance to the subject, the distance to the subject is actually the third criteria which influences the depth of field. The closer your subject is to the camera, the less depth of field you get. In these examples, we will keep our aperture the same and our focal length of the lens the same as well. The only thing we will change is the distance from the camera to the subject. So, with short distance from the camera to the subject, you will get shorter depth of field. And the bigger the distance from the camera to the subject, the bigger becomes depth of field. Let's see how it works. For these images, I used my 50mm lens, so I wasn't changing my focal length at all, and I used aperture of f2, which is pretty big aperture opening. So in this picture, when my subject is close to the camera, you can see that the figurine of the man, which is behind the woman, is out of focus since I was focusing on the woman. Let's see what happened when we change the position of the subject from the camera. I hope you all noticed the further the subject is from the camera, the more depth of field we get. And in this final image, when the subject is much further from the camera than in the first image, you can see that the both of them are in focus, even if we use the big aperture opening such as f2. Let's summarize everything we learned today. In this lesson, we were talking about depth of field. Depth of field is a distance between the nearest and the furthest subject in the image which appears sharp or in focus. So if you, for example, take a picture of the person, and you have a foreground and the background in the image. If you have a shallow depth of field, your person will be in focus, but your foreground and your background will be out of focus, blurry. Or if you have a broad depth of field, everything will appear in focus. Your foreground, your background, and the person will appear in focus. And you can control how much depth of field you have. You have to control this distance of depth of field. There is 3 ways to control it. The depth of field depends on the aperture, focal length of the lens, and also the distance of the subject from the camera. And remember, the bigger the aperture, the shallower depth of field you get, the smaller depth of field you get. The longer the focal length of the lens, the smaller the depth of field you get. And also the closer the subject is to the camera, the smaller depth of field you get. I hope this lesson was helpful, and please let me know what do you think about my tutorials. Please rate, comment and subscribe. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye bye.